Sarah Martinez walked into the small coffee shop on Main Street, her worn sneakers making barely a sound on the wooden floor. She had chosen this quiet town in Montana specifically because nobody would know her here. After 8 years as a Navy SEAL, she wanted nothing more than to disappear into a simple life, where her biggest worry was whether the local bakery had fresh muffins. The coffee shop owner, Mrs. Chun, smiled warmly as Sarah approached the counter. "The usual?" she asked, already reaching for a medium cup. "Please," Sarah replied, her voice soft but carrying an undertone that spoke of confidence earned through years of facing life and death situations. She had been coming here every morning for 3 months since moving to Millfield, and Mrs. Chun had become one of the few people she actually enjoyed talking to. As Sarah waited for her coffee, she noticed 3 men in expensive suits sitting in the corner booth. They looked completely out of place in this small-town coffee shop where most customers wore flannel shirts and work boots. Something about their presence made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Old habits died hard, and her training had taught her to notice when things didn't fit the normal pattern. "Here you go, dear," Mrs. Chin said, handing over the steaming cup. "Extra shot of espresso, just like you like it." Sarah thanked her and was about to leave when she heard raised voices from the corner booth. The 3 men were now standing over Mrs. Chin's teenage son, David, who had been quietly doing homework at a nearby table. "Your mother needs to understand that this protection fee isn't optional," one of the men said, his voice carrying the kind of cold authority that comes from never being told no. He was tall and thin with slicked-back hair and a scar running down his left cheek. $5,000 a month is a small price to pay for keeping this place safe. David looked terrified, his textbook shaking in his hands. "My mom already told you we don't have that kind of money. We're barely making rent as it is." The second man, shorter but built like a bodybuilder, stepped closer to David. "Maybe we need to help you understand how important it is to pay for protection in this town." He cracked his knuckles in a way that suggested he enjoyed using them on people who couldn't fight back. Sarah felt her muscles tense. She had walked away from a world of violence and conflict, seeking peace in this quiet town. But watching these men threaten an innocent family brought back every protective instinct she had developed during her military service. Mrs. Chun rushed over from behind the counter, her face pale with fear. "Please, just leave my son alone. I already told Mr. Castellano that we can't afford what you're asking. Business has been slow since the factory closed down." The third man, who appeared to be the leader, smiled in a way that made Sarah's stomach turn. He was middle-aged with perfectly styled gray hair and the kind of smile politicians wore when they were about to break campaign promises. "Mrs. Chun, you seem to think this is a negotiation. Let me be clear, it's not. You pay, or bad things start happening to your business. And maybe to your family." Several other customers in the coffee shop looked uncomfortable, but none of them moved to help. Sarah could see the fear in their eyes. These weren't the kind of men you stood up to unless you had a very good reason to believe you could win. "What if I refuse?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The bodybuilder type reached into his jacket and pulled out a small crowbar. "Accidents happen, lady. Windows break, coffee machines stop working, sometimes people slip and fall downstairs. Would hate for any of those accidents to happen here." That was enough for Sarah. She had spent years protecting innocent people from bullies with guns and power. She wasn't about to stop now just because she had traded her military uniform for civilian clothes. "Excuse me," Sarah said, walking over to the group with her coffee still in hand. Her voice was calm and polite, but there was something in her tone that made all 4 people turn to look at her. "Is there a problem here?" The leader looked her up and down dismissively. Sarah was 5 feet 6 inches tall, with shoulder-length brown hair, and the kind of lean build that came from functional fitness rather than gym workouts. In her jeans and simple sweater, she looked like any other small-town woman in her early 30s. "No problem that concerns you, lady," the leader said with a condescending smile. "This is business between us and Mrs. Chun. I suggest you mind your own affairs and finish your coffee somewhere else." Sarah took a sip of her coffee and remained standing exactly where she was. "I'm a regular customer here. Mrs. Chun makes excellent coffee, and David always helps me with my computer when it acts up. So actually, their business is my business." The man with the crowbar stepped toward Sarah, using his size to try to intimidate her. Listen, sweetheart, you don't want to get involved in something you don't understand. These people owe money to some very serious individuals. How much money? Sarah asked, as if she were asking about the weather. $5,000 a month for protection services, the leader answered, clearly annoyed that this woman wasn't backing down. Not that it's any of your concern. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Protection from what, exactly? This is Millfield, Montana. The biggest crime here is usually someone jaywalking or teenagers toilet papering houses on Halloween. The scarred man laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Protection from us, obviously. You pay, or we make sure your business has problems. Equipment breaks, customers stop coming. Maybe the health inspector finds violations that need expensive fixes. So you're threatening to vandalize their business unless they pay you money they don't have, Sarah said, her voice still perfectly calm. That sounds like extortion to me. The bodybuilder moved even closer to Sarah, now standing only a few feet away. You've got a smart mouth, lady. Maybe someone needs to teach you when to keep it shut. Sarah looked up at him without flinching. During her military service, she had faced enemy combatants who were better armed, better trained, and far more dangerous than these small-town criminals. This man might be physically imposing to most people, but to someone who had completed Navy SEAL training, he was just another obstacle to overcome. I'll make you a deal, Sarah said, setting her coffee cup down on the nearest table. You three leave Mrs. Chun and her family alone, and I won't have to embarrass you in front of all these nice people. The entire coffee shop had gone silent. Even the soft jazz music playing in the background seemed quieter than before. The other customers were staring in disbelief at this ordinary-looking woman who was calmly threatening three men who looked like they could bench press a small car. The leader's face darkened with anger. Lady, you have no idea who you're dealing with. We work for Vincent Castellano. He owns half this county, and he doesn't take kindly to people interfering with his operations. Sarah had heard that name before. During her first week in Millfield, she had overheard conversations at the grocery store and gas station about a crime boss who had moved into the area and was slowly taking control of local businesses. She had hoped to avoid any involvement in local conflicts, but apparently, conflict had found her. Vincent Castellano, Sarah repeated. Italian guy, probably mid-50s, thinks he's some kind of movie gangster? You know him? The scarred man asked, suddenly, looking uncertain. We've never met, but I've dealt with his type before, Sarah said. Men who think fear and violence make them powerful, when really they're just bullies who never learned to solve problems like adults. The bodybuilder's face turned red with anger. That's enough. Nobody talks about Mr. Castellano like that. He reached out to grab Sarah's arm, intending to physically remove her from the situation. Sarah moved faster than anyone in the coffee shop could follow. Years of hand-to-hand combat training had taught her that the first rule of self-defense was to never let an attacker get a solid grip on you. She stepped slightly to the side, caught the man's outstretched arm, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling past her into a nearby table. The man crashed into the table, sending coffee cups and a newspaper flying. He rolled off the table and onto the floor, looking more shocked than hurt. He scrambled to his feet, his face now purple with embarrassment and rage. You're going to regret that, he snarled, reaching into his jacket for what Sarah assumed was a weapon. But Sarah had already moved again. Before he could draw whatever he was reaching for, she had crossed the distance between them and delivered a precise strike to a pressure point on his neck. The man's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious but unharmed. The leader and the scarred man stared in shock at their unconscious colleague. Around the coffee shop, customers were pulling out their phones, some calling 911, and others recording video of the confrontation. What the hell are you? The leader demanded, his voice no longer carrying the confident authority it had before. Someone who doesn't like bullies, Sarah replied simply. She turned to Mrs. Chun, who was standing behind the counter with her mouth open in amazement. Mrs. Chun, are you okay? Yes, I think so, Mrs. Chun stammered. How did you do that? Before Sarah could answer, the scarred man had pulled a gun from inside his jacket. Everybody stay calm, he shouted, waving the weapon around the coffee shop. This crazy woman just assaulted our friend, and now she's going to pay for it. Several customers screamed, and ducked under tables. David grabbed his mother's hand and pulled her down behind the counter. Sarah remained standing exactly where she was, her eyes focused on the gunman with the kind of intense concentration that comes from years of tactical training. "Put the gun down," Sarah said quietly. "You're already looking at charges for extortion and threats. Don't add armed robbery and assault to your problems." "Shut up," the man yelled, pointing the gun directly at Sarah. "You think you're some kind of hero? Let's see how heroic you feel with a bullet in your chest." Sarah evaluated the situation in the split second she had been trained to use. The gunman was holding his weapon incorrectly, with poor stance and shaky hands that suggested he wasn't comfortable with firearms. He was standing too close to her, well within the range where someone with her training could disarm him before he could react. Most importantly, he was pointing the gun directly at her instead of keeping it in a position where he could quickly shift targets. "Last warning," Sarah said. "Put it down and walk away." "Go to hell," the gunman replied, his finger tightening on the trigger. Sarah moved like lightning. She stepped to the side, while simultaneously reaching up to grab the man's wrist, forcing the gun to point toward the ceiling. In the same fluid motion, she twisted his arm and applied pressure to his elbow joint in a way that made him cry out in pain and immediately released the weapon. The gun clattered to the floor, and Sarah kicked it across the coffee shop toward the counter where Mrs. Chun was hiding. The scarred man tried to throw a punch at her face, but Sarah ducked under it and responded with a knee to his solar plexus that doubled him over and left him gasping for breath. The leader of the group looked around the coffee shop at his two incapacitated colleagues and made a decision. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the door. "Mr. Castellano is going to hear about this, and when he does, you're going to wish you had minded your own business." "Tell Mr. Castellano that Sarah Martinez said hello," Sarah replied. "And tell him that if he or any of his people come back here to threaten Mrs. Chun or anyone else in this town, they're going to have a much bigger problem than they bargained for." The leader paused at the door, clearly recognizing that Sarah's last name was Hispanic and wondering if she might be connected to some rival criminal organization. "Martinez? I don't know that name." "You will," Sarah said simply. The man left, abandoning his two unconscious and wounded colleagues. Within minutes, the coffee shop was filled with the sound of sirens as police and paramedics arrived to deal with the situation. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a mustache that had seen better days, surveyed the scene with the weary expression of someone who had been dealing with Vincent Castellano's influence for months. "Mrs. Chun," he said, "are you and David okay?" "Yes, Sheriff," Mrs. Chun replied, still looking shaken. "This woman, Sarah, she saved us. Those men were demanding money and threatening us, and she stood up to them." Sheriff Bradley looked at Sarah, who was calmly answering questions from one of his deputies. "Sarah Martinez, right? You moved here about 3 months ago." "That's right," Sarah confirmed. "I was just having coffee when these gentlemen decided to threaten Mrs. Chun and her son. I felt obligated to intervene." "Obligated?" the sheriff repeated, looking at the two unconscious men who were being loaded onto stretchers by paramedics. "Most people would have called 911 and stayed out of the way. What's your background that made you feel qualified to take on 3 armed men?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided that honesty was the best policy. "I'm former military, Sheriff. I have some training in self-defense." "What branch?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "Navy," Sarah replied, leaving out the specific details of her service that would raise more questions than she was prepared to answer. Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone was being truthful but not complete in their answers. "Well, whatever training you had, it probably saved lives today. These guys work for Vincent Castellano, and they've been making the rounds to every business in town for the past 6 months. Has anyone filed charges against them?" Sarah asked. The sheriff's expression darkened. "People are scared. Castellano has connections throughout the county government, and witnesses have a way of changing their stories or disappearing entirely. This is the first time anyone has actually stood up to his people." Sarah looked around the coffee shop at the other customers, who were still staring at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Well, maybe it's time someone did." As the paramedics wheeled the unconscious men out of the coffee shop, One of the deputies approached Sheriff Bradley with a concerned expression. "Sheriff, we found this in the pocket of the guy with the scar." He held up a small notebook filled with handwritten entries. Sheriff Bradley flipped through the pages, his face growing more serious with each entry he read. "This is a list of every business in town, along with the amounts they're supposed to pay for protection. Mrs. Chun, it looks like you're one of about 30 businesses they're targeting." Mrs. Chun sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what she was hearing. 30 businesses? "Sheriff, we can't all be expected to pay thousands of dollars to these criminals." "You won't have to," Sarah said quietly, but with the kind of certainty that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. "Not if I have anything to say about it." Sheriff Bradley studied Sarah's face, seeing something in her eyes that suggested she was far more than just a former Navy sailor with some self-defense training. "Ms. Martinez, I appreciate what you did here today, but Vincent Castellano isn't the kind of man who lets challenges to his authority go unanswered. These three were just the beginning. When he hears about what happened, he's going to escalate." Sarah finished the last sip of her now-cold coffee and set the cup down with a soft clink. "Sheriff, in my experience, bullies keep pushing until someone pushes back harder than they're willing to push. Today was just the first push." As Sarah walked toward the door, Mrs. Chin called after her. "Sarah, wait. Why did you do this? You don't even know us that well." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to face the room full of people who were looking at her as if she had just performed a miracle. "Mrs. Chun, you make the best coffee I've had in years, and David helped me set up my wireless internet when I moved here. In my book, that makes you family, and nobody threatens my family." As Sarah left the coffee shop and walked down Main Street toward her small rental house, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet retirement had just come to an abrupt end. She had come to Millfield to escape the world of violence and conflict, but apparently, that world had followed her here. Behind her, the coffee shop was buzzing with excited conversation as customers called friends and family to tell them about the woman who had single-handedly taken down 3 of Vincent Castellano's enforcers. Word was already spreading throughout the small town that someone had finally stood up to the crime boss who had been terrorizing local businesses. What none of them knew was that Sarah Martinez was not just a former Navy sailor with some self-defense training. She was a decorated Navy SEAL who had completed some of the most dangerous missions in modern military history. She had taken down enemy combatants in places most people couldn't pronounce, and she had been specially trained to handle exactly the kind of situation that Vincent Castellano represented. As she walked home, Sarah began mentally preparing for what was almost certainly going to be a war. She had hoped to leave that life behind, but sometimes the skills you learn in service of your country are exactly the skills your community needs. And if Vincent Castellano wanted to find out what happened when you threatened the wrong person's family, Sarah was more than willing to provide that education. Vincent Castellano received the phone call about the coffee shop incident while he was sitting in his office above the Millfield Bank, reviewing the financial reports from his various business ventures. The office was decorated like something from a movie about organized crime, with dark wood paneling, expensive leather furniture, and photographs of himself with various political figures whose campaigns he had generously supported. "What do you mean, unconscious?" Castellano asked, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that his associates had learned to fear. He was a man who prided himself on maintaining control over every situation, and the idea that some random woman had disrupted his carefully planned operation was both infuriating and concerning. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Marcus, the leader of the 3-man team who had been collecting protection money. "Boss, this wasn't some lucky housewife who got scared and fought back. This woman knew exactly what she was doing. She moved like a professional." Castellano leaned back in his chair, processing this information. He had built his criminal enterprise by being smarter and more ruthless than his competitors, and part of that intelligence involved recognizing when a situation required more careful analysis than usual. "Tell me everything," he said, "and don't leave out any details." Marcus described the entire confrontation, from Sarah's calm intervention to her precise takedown of 2 armed men. As he spoke, Castellano pulled up a laptop and began typing notes, his mind already working through the implications of what he was hearing. "She knew your names?" Castellano asked when Marcus finished his report. "Not our names, but She knew your name. And, boss, when I told her we'd be back, she told me to tell you that Sarah Martinez said hello. She said it like she wanted you to know exactly who had done this. Castellano stopped typing and stared at the computer screen. In his years of criminal activity, he had learned to pay attention when someone wanted him to know their identity after directly challenging his authority. That suggested either incredible stupidity or dangerous confidence. Martinez, he repeated. Hispanic name. Could be she's connected to the Guerrero family out of Denver, or maybe the Morales organization from Texas. That's what I was thinking, Marcus agreed. But, boss, I've never seen anyone move like that. Tony and Rick are both big guys who know how to handle themselves, and she dropped them like they were children. Whatever training she has, it's military grade. After ending the call, Castellano spent the next 2 hours making phone calls to his contacts throughout the criminal underworld. He had relationships with organizations across the western United States, and if Sarah Martinez was connected to any of them, he needed to know before he made his next move. But every contact he called gave him the same answer. They had never heard of anyone named Sarah Martinez who matched the description of the woman from the coffee shop. By evening, Castellano was convinced that he was dealing with someone operating independently, which raised even more questions about her background and capabilities. Meanwhile, Sarah was at home in her small rental house, conducting her own research. She had a secure laptop computer that she used to access databases and resources that most civilians didn't know existed. Her military clearance had been deactivated when she left active duty, but she still had contacts in the intelligence community who owed her favors from their time serving together. After an hour of careful investigation, she had compiled a detailed profile of Vincent Castellano and his organization. He had started as a low-level enforcer for a crime family in Chicago before moving west to establish his own operation. His criminal record included charges for extortion, money laundering, and assault, though he had never been convicted of anything more serious than tax evasion. More importantly, Sarah learned that Castellano's organization was relatively small, but growing rapidly. He employed about 20 people in various criminal activities, from debt collection to illegal gambling. His power came not from the size of his organization, but from his willingness to use violence and his connections to corrupt local officials. The next morning, Sarah returned to Mrs. Chin's coffee shop to find it busier than she had ever seen it. Word had spread throughout Millfield about the previous day's confrontation, and people were coming by to hear the story firsthand and to show their support for the Chin family. Sarah, Mrs. Chin called out when she saw her regular customer walk through the door. I was hoping you would come in today. I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Just glad I could help, Sarah replied, though she noticed that several customers were staring at her with the kind of awed respect usually reserved for celebrities or war heroes. As she waited for her coffee, Sarah overheard conversations at nearby tables about other businesses in town that had been visited by Castellano's collectors. The pattern was always the same. Well-dressed men would arrive demanding monthly protection payments, and business owners would agree out of fear for their safety and the safety of their families. The problem is, one customer was saying to his friend, even if we all wanted to refuse to pay, most of us don't have the skills to fight back like Sarah did yesterday. These guys have guns, and they're not afraid to use them. Sarah turned to address the man directly. What if you didn't have to fight them individually? The conversation in the coffee shop gradually died down as people realized that Sarah was speaking to them as a group. She hadn't intended to give a speech, but she found herself standing in front of a room full of people who were looking to her for guidance. I've been thinking about this situation, Sarah continued, and it seems to me that Mr. Castellano's power comes from the fact that he can intimidate people one at a time. But what if instead of dealing with him individually, this community dealt with him collectively? An older man wearing a farmer's work shirt raised his hand. You mean like forming some kind of citizens' patrol? Not exactly, Sarah said. I mean like documenting every instance of extortion, gathering evidence that can be used by law enforcement, and making it clear to Mr. Castellano that this town is not going to be an easy target. Sheriff Bradley, who had been sitting quietly in the corner booth, stood up and joined the conversation. Ms. Martinez, I appreciate the sentiment, but Castellano has been very careful to operate in ways that make prosecuting him difficult. His men make verbal threats rather than written demands. They don't leave evidence behind. And witnesses have a tendency to change their stories when it comes time to testify. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had been living in fear for months. Sheriff, what if witnesses didn't have to be afraid? What if Castellano's organization was neutralized before it got bigger and more dangerous? What exactly are you suggesting? Sheriff Bradley asked, though his tone suggested he already had an idea of where this conversation was heading. Before Sarah could answer, the door of the coffee shop opened, and 4 men in expensive suits walked in. Unlike the 3 men from the previous day, these 4 moved with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested military or police training. They arranged themselves strategically around the coffee shop, with 2 near the door and 2 near the counter, in a formation that would allow them to control all possible exits. The man who appeared to be their leader was tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested he was higher up in Castellano's organization than the previous day's collectors. He surveyed the room with the confident smile of someone who was used to being feared. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a voice that carried easily throughout the coffee shop, "my name is Thomas Kane, and I work for Mr. Vincent Castellano. I'm here to address some misunderstandings that occurred yesterday." Sarah remained seated at her table, but Sheriff Bradley stood up and moved toward Kane. "Mr. Kane, if you're here on official business, I'd like to see some identification." Kane reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "I'm a licensed private investigator, Sheriff. My employer has asked me to resolve some conflicts that arose yesterday between his employees and certain members of this community." "Your employer's employees were extorting money from local businesses?" Sheriff Bradley replied. "That's not a conflict, it's a crime." Kane's smile never wavered. "Sheriff, I think there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of the services Mr. Castellano's organization provides. We offer legitimate security consulting for businesses that are concerned about theft, vandalism, and other criminal activities." An angry murmur ran through the coffee shop as people realized that Kane was attempting to reframe extortion as a legitimate business service. "Security consulting," Sarah said from her table, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard throughout the room. "That's an interesting way to describe threatening people with violence unless they pay you money." Kane turned to look at Sarah, and she could see in his eyes that he was evaluating her just as carefully as she was evaluating him. Unlike the previous day's enforcers, this man was a professional who understood the importance of gathering intelligence before taking action. "You must be Sarah Martinez," Kane said, walking over to her table. "I've heard quite a lot about you in the past 24 hours. "All good things, I hope," Sarah replied, taking a sip of her coffee. Kane pulled out a chair and sat down across from her without being invited. "That depends on your perspective. From my employer's point of view, you assaulted 3 of his employees and interfered with legitimate business activities." "From my perspective," Sarah said calmly, "I stopped 3 criminals from threatening an innocent family. Different points of view, I suppose." Kane leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice so that their conversation became more private. "Ms. Martinez, my research suggests that you're an intelligent woman who understands how the world really works. Mr. Castellano admires your skills, and he's prepared to make you a generous offer." "What kind of offer?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew where this conversation was heading. "A position within his organization. Head of security for all his business operations in this region. The salary would be quite substantial, and you would have considerable autonomy in how you handle security matters." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Kane's face. "In other words, he wants to buy me off. If I join his organization, I stop being a problem and become an asset. I prefer to think of it as recognizing talent and putting it to good use," Kane replied. "You clearly have exceptional skills, and Mr. Castellano believes those skills would be better utilized in service of a larger organization rather than wasted in a small-town coffee shop." Around the room, other customers were straining to hear the conversation between Sarah and Kane. Sarah was aware that her response would be heard and remembered by everyone present, and that whatever she said next would set the tone for everything that happened afterward. "Mr. Kane," Sarah said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear, "please tell Mr. Castellano that I appreciate his offer, but I'm not interested in working for someone who threatens innocent families for money. Kane's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see a flash of something dangerous in his eyes. Ms. Martinez, I think you may be underestimating the benefits of cooperation and overestimating the consequences of continued interference. Is that a threat? Sheriff Bradley asked, moving closer to Sarah's table. Kane stood up smoothly, adjusting his suit jacket. Not at all, Sheriff. Simply a professional assessment of the situation. Mr. Castellano is a reasonable man who prefers to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than confrontation. However, he also expects his reasonable offers to be seriously considered. Sarah also stood up, and Kane realized for the first time that despite her unassuming appearance, there was something about her posture and presence that suggested she was far more dangerous than she appeared. During her military service, Sarah had learned to project the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever situation might arise. Mr. Kane, Sarah said, please tell Mr. Castellano that his offer has been seriously considered and politely declined. Also tell him that if any of his people return to threaten Mrs. Chun or any other business owner in this town, they're going to find out exactly why that offer was declined. Kane nodded slowly, recognizing that further negotiation would be pointless. I'll relay your message, Ms. Martinez. I hope you'll reconsider your position before the situation escalates beyond anyone's ability to control. After Kane and his associates left the coffee shop, the room erupted in excited conversation. People who had been living in fear for months suddenly felt like they had a champion, someone willing to stand up to Vincent Castellano on their behalf. But Sheriff Bradley approached Sarah with a concerned expression. Ms. Martinez, I have to ask again about your background. Thomas Kane is not the kind of man Castellano sends unless he's taking this situation very seriously. Kane is former military police, and he's been involved in some very dangerous situations over the years. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who were counting on her to protect them from a criminal organization that was growing more powerful every day. She had hoped to keep her military background private, but it was becoming clear that half measures and misdirection would not be enough to deal with Vincent Castellano. Sheriff, Sarah said quietly, I think it's time I told you exactly who I am and what I'm capable of. That evening, Sarah met Sheriff Bradley at his office after hours. The sheriff's station was a small building that reflected the usually peaceful nature of Millfield, with holding cells that were rarely used and file cabinets full of reports about minor traffic violations and property disputes. Sheriff, Sarah began, I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is confidential. My presence in Millfield was supposed to be part of a quiet retirement, and I'd prefer to keep it that way. Sheriff Bradley nodded, settling back in his chair. Ms. Martinez, after what I've seen in the past 2 days, I think it's safe to say that your quiet retirement may already be over. Sarah took a deep breath and began to explain her military service. She told Sheriff Bradley about her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, about the specialized training she had received, and about some of the missions she had completed in various parts of the world. She described her expertise in hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, tactical planning, and psychological operations. When she finished, Sheriff Bradley sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he had just learned. Ms. Martinez, he finally said, you're telling me that you're one of the most highly trained special operations soldiers in the world, and you've been living quietly in my town for 3 months making small talk with Mrs. Chun about coffee recipes. That was the plan, Sarah confirmed. I wanted a quiet life where my biggest worry was whether the grocery store had fresh vegetables. And now, Sarah looked out the window of the sheriff's office at the quiet streets of Millfield. Now I have a choice. I can pack up and move somewhere else, hoping that Vincent Castellano will lose interest in this town without me here to challenge him. Or I can stay and make sure he understands that threatening innocent people has consequences. Sheriff Bradley leaned forward in his chair. Ms. Martinez, if you stay, this is going to become a war. Castellano won't back down from a direct challenge to his authority, and he has resources and connections that could make life very difficult for everyone involved. Sheriff, Sarah said, I've been in wars before. The difference is that this time, I'm fighting for a community that I've chosen to be part of rather than objectives set by politicians thousands of miles away. That makes it personal. As they continued talking, Sheriff Bradley shared what he knew about Castellano's organization and the extent of corruption in the local government. Sarah learned that several county commissioners had been receiving campaign contributions from Castellano, and that some local judges had been making unusually lenient rulings in cases involving his associates. The problem, Sheriff Bradley explained, is that Castellano has been very careful to stay within legal boundaries while creating an atmosphere of fear. His men make verbal threats rather than written ones. They avoid direct violence in favor of intimidation, and they always make sure there are no witnesses who can't be discredited. Sarah nodded, recognizing the pattern. He's building a criminal organization using legitimate business practices as cover. It's smart, and it makes him harder to prosecute using traditional law enforcement methods. Exactly. And now you've forced him into a position where he has to either back down, which would damage his reputation and authority, or escalate to more direct confrontation, which would expose him to greater legal risk. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town she had chosen as her home. Sheriff, what if we didn't wait for him to choose? What if we forced him to make mistakes that would give you the evidence you need to prosecute him? What did you have in mind? Sarah turned back to face the sheriff with the kind of determined expression that had carried her through some of the most dangerous missions in modern military history. I'm going to give Mr. Castellano exactly what he's asking for. A direct confrontation with someone who understands his business better than he does. Sheriff Bradley realized that Sarah Martinez was no longer thinking like a civilian who wanted to help her community. She was thinking like a special operations soldier who had identified a target and was planning a mission to neutralize it. Ms. Martinez, he said carefully, I need to know that whatever you're planning will be within legal boundaries. I can't be part of anything that crosses the line into vigilante justice. Sarah smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. Sheriff, everything I learned in the military was about completing missions while operating within rules of engagement. The rules are different here, but the principles are the same. Protect innocent people, neutralize threats, and always make sure you can justify your actions afterward. As Sarah left the sheriff's office that night, both she and Sheriff Bradley understood that the quiet town of Millfield was about to become the center of a conflict that would determine whether a criminal organization could intimidate an entire community into submission, or whether one highly trained woman could prove that bullies only have power when good people are afraid to fight back. Vincent Castellano stood in front of the large window in his office, looking down at the main street of Millfield while Thomas Kane delivered Sarah's response to his job offer. The rejection didn't surprise him, but the confident manner in which it had been delivered suggested that he was dealing with someone who understood exactly what kind of war she was starting. She's not going to be intimidated, Kane reported, and the way she carries herself suggests serious training. I'd estimate military special forces, possibly Marine Force Recon or Army Special Forces. Castellano turned away from the window, his mind already working through various strategies for dealing with this new threat to his organization. What about the local population? Are they rallying around her? Definitely. The coffee shop was packed with people who seemed to view her as some kind of savior. And Sheriff Bradley appears to be taking her seriously as well. Castellano nodded slowly. In his experience, the most dangerous opponents were those who had community support and official backing. Sarah Martinez was rapidly becoming exactly that type of opponent. Mr. Kane, Castellano said, I want you to arrange a demonstration. Something that will remind this community what happens when people interfere with our business operations. But I want it done in a way that can't be directly traced back to us. Kane understood immediately what his employer was requesting. What kind of demonstration? Mrs. Chen's coffee shop has become a symbol of resistance. I want that symbol eliminated, but I want it to look like an accident or random vandalism. Can you arrange that? Kane considered the logistics of what Castellano was asking. It would be risky. Sarah Martinez is clearly watching for exactly this kind of retaliation. Then, we make sure she's somewhere else when it happens, Castellano replied. Use your imagination, Mr. Kane. You're paid to solve problems, not to list reasons why they can't be solved. That same evening, Sarah was at home reviewing intelligence she had gathered about Castellano's organization when her secure phone rang. The caller identification showed a number she recognized from her military service. Martinez, she answered. Sarah, it's Colonel Jenkins. I heard you might be having some trouble with organized crime in your new hometown. Colonel Jenkins had been Sarah's commanding officer during her last 2 years of active duty, and she had maintained contact with him after her retirement. He was one of the few people who knew about her current location and her desire for a quiet civilian life. Word travels fast, Sarah replied. How did you hear about Millfield? Sheriff Bradley called the FBI field office in Billings, and they reached out to military intelligence to see if they had any information about a former Navy SEAL named Sarah Martinez. Your name set off some flags, and eventually someone called me. Sarah walked to her window and looked out at the quiet street, wondering how many of her neighbors had any idea that their peaceful community was about to become a battlefield. Colonel, this wasn't supposed to happen. I came here to disappear, not to start a war with the local crime boss. Sarah, you and I both know that you can't walk away from a situation like this. It's not in your nature to let bullies threaten innocent people, and from what I've heard, Vincent Castellano is exactly the kind of bully you've spent your career fighting. Colonel Jenkins was right, and Sarah knew it. During her military service, she had volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions available because she couldn't stand the idea of innocent people suffering when she had the skills to help them. What kind of support can you provide? Sarah asked. Officially, nothing. This is a domestic law enforcement matter, and the military can't get involved. Unofficially, I can make sure that certain resources become available to local law enforcement if they happen to request them. Sarah understood the colonel's meaning. While he couldn't provide direct military assistance, he could ensure that Sheriff Bradley had access to intelligence resources and technical equipment that would normally be unavailable to a small-town police department. There's something else, Colonel Jenkins continued. I did some checking on Vincent Castellano, and his organization has connections to some groups we've been monitoring for national security reasons. If you can gather evidence of those connections, it might provide justification for federal involvement. After ending the call, Sarah spent several hours planning her approach to the situation. She had learned during her military service that the key to defeating a larger, better-equipped enemy was to force them to fight on your terms rather than theirs. Castellano expected her to react defensively to his threats, but Sarah intended to take the initiative and force him into making mistakes. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Mrs. Chen's coffee shop to find it unusually quiet. Instead of the usual crowd of supporters and curious townspeople, there were only a few regular customers sitting nervously at their tables. Mrs. Chen, Sarah said as she approached the counter. Where is everyone? Mrs. Chen looked worried as she poured Sarah's usual coffee. People have been getting phone calls all morning. Anonymous calls warning them to stay away from the coffee shop if they don't want trouble. Sarah felt her anger rising. Castellano was using fear tactics to isolate her from community support, a classic strategy for dealing with insurgent threats. But Sarah had dealt with fear tactics before, and she knew that the best response was to demonstrate that they were ineffective. Mrs. Chun, I need you to close the shop for the rest of the day and take David somewhere safe. I think Mr. Castellano is planning something, and I don't want you caught in the middle. What about you? Mrs. Chen asked. If they're planning something, shouldn't you stay away too? Sarah smiled grimly. Mrs. Chun, if they're planning something, I want to be here when they try it. It's been a while since I've had a chance to show someone exactly why threatening innocent families is a bad idea. After Mrs. Chun and her son left, Sarah positioned herself in the coffee shop where she could observe both the front entrance and the back alley. She had learned during her military service that the key to surviving an ambush was to see it coming before your enemies realized you were ready for them. She didn't have to wait long. Around noon, she noticed two men in work clothes setting up what appeared to be utility equipment in the alley behind the coffee shop. Their movements were too coordinated and their equipment too sophisticated for routine utility work. Sarah slipped out the back door of the coffee shop and approached the men from an angle that kept her out of their direct line of sight. As she got closer, she could see that they were installing some kind of electronic device near the building's gas line. Excuse me, Sarah said, stepping into view with her hands visible, but ready to move quickly if necessary. What kind of work are you doing here? The two men turned to face her, and Sarah immediately recognized that they were not utility workers. They moved with the kind of alertness and coordination that suggested security or law enforcement backgrounds. Gas line maintenance, one of them replied, but his explanation was delivered in the tone of someone who wasn't expecting to be questioned and wasn't comfortable lying. Sarah looked at the device they had been installing and realized it was designed to create a gas leak that could be remotely triggered to cause an explosion. The explosion would destroy the coffee shop and could easily be blamed on an old building with aging infrastructure. "That's interesting," Sarah said conversationally, "because I called the gas company this morning to ask about scheduled maintenance in this area, and they told me there wasn't any plan for this week." The two men exchanged a quick look, and Sarah saw one of them reach toward what was probably a concealed weapon. She moved faster than either man could react, closing the distance between them and striking the closer man with a precise blow to a nerve cluster that instantly paralyzed his arm. The second man tried to draw his weapon, but Sarah had already moved on to him. She grabbed his wrist and applied a joint lock that forced him to drop the gun, while simultaneously putting him in a position where any attempt to resist would result in a broken arm. "Gentlemen," Sarah said calmly, "I think we need to have a conversation about who sent you here and what you were planning to do with that device." Within minutes, Sarah had learned that the two men were private contractors hired by Thomas Kane to plant an explosive device that would destroy the coffee shop later that evening. The explosion was supposed to look like an accident caused by an old gas line, and it was intended to send a message to the community about the consequences of supporting her resistance to Castellano's organization. Sarah called Sheriff Bradley, who arrived with 2 deputies to arrest the contractors and secure the explosive device. As they processed the scene, Sheriff Bradley pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Martinez, this changes everything. Attempted murder using explosives is a federal crime, and the fact that Castellano ordered it gives us grounds for FBI involvement." Sarah nodded, but her expression was grim. "Sheriff, this also means that Castellano has decided to escalate beyond intimidation tactics. He's willing to risk killing innocent people to maintain his control over this town. What do you think he'll do next?" Sarah looked around the alley where the explosive device had been planted, mentally calculating the level of destruction it would have caused. "He'll try to eliminate me directly. The contractors were probably supposed to make sure I was inside the coffee shop when the explosion happened." That evening, Sarah was at home preparing for what she expected would be Castellano's next move when her phone rang. The caller identification showed Sheriff Bradley's number. "Sheriff, Ms. Martinez, we have a problem. Thomas Kane just called the station and demanded to speak with you. He says Castellano wants to arrange a meeting to discuss a peaceful resolution to the current situation." Sarah was immediately suspicious. In her experience, criminals who had just attempted murder were not usually interested in peaceful negotiations. "What kind of meeting?" "Kane says Castellano wants to meet with you tonight at the old grain elevator on the edge of town. Just the two of you. No weapons, no backup. He says it's a chance for both sides to step back from a confrontation that's getting out of hand." Sarah knew that the grain elevator was an isolated location with multiple levels and numerous places for hidden shooters. It was exactly the kind of location someone would choose if they were planning an ambush rather than a negotiation. "Sheriff, it's a trap. Castellano has no intention of negotiating. He wants to lure me to an isolated location where his people can eliminate me without witnesses." "That's what I figured," Sheriff Bradley replied. "But Kane was very insistent, and he said that if you don't show up, Castellano will assume you're too frightened to face him directly. He's challenging your reputation." Sarah understood immediately what was happening. Castellano was trying to manipulate her into making a tactical error by appealing to her pride and sense of honor. He was betting that a former Special Forces soldier wouldn't be able to resist the challenge to prove her courage. "Sheriff," Sarah said, "please tell Mr. Kane that I'll be there at the specified time. But I want you to understand that I'm not going there to negotiate." "What are you planning?" Sarah checked her watch and began mentally reviewing the tactical equipment she had stored in her house. "I'm planning to give Vincent Castellano exactly what he's asking for. A direct confrontation with someone who understands his business better than he does." 2 hours later, Sarah approached the grain elevator complex from the north, using the kind of stealth movement techniques she had learned during her military service. She was wearing dark clothing and carrying equipment that would allow her to operate effectively in a night combat environment. As she had expected, the grain elevator was not empty. Using night vision equipment, She counted at least 8 men positioned at various points around the complex. They were armed with automatic weapons and positioned to create crossfire that would eliminate anyone approaching the main building. Sarah smiled grimly as she recognized the tactical setup. Castellano had hired professionals to plan this ambush, but they were thinking like criminals rather than soldiers. They had positioned their people to control the obvious approaches to the grain elevator, but they had not considered that someone with special operations training might not use the obvious approaches. Sarah spent 30 minutes moving through the complex, using shadows and industrial equipment for concealment while she identified the location of each hostile shooter. She had learned during her military service that the key to surviving an ambush was to turn it around on the people who had set it up. When she was ready, Sarah used her phone to call the number Thomas Kane had provided for the meeting. "Ms. Martinez?" Kane answered. "Are you here for the meeting?" "I'm here," Sarah replied. "But I have to say, Mr. Castellano's idea of a private meeting includes an awful lot of people with guns." There was a pause before Kane responded. "I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Castellano is waiting for you inside the main building, just as we discussed." "Mr. Kane," Sarah said, "please tell your shooters that they're positioned at the following locations." She proceeded to describe the exact position of each armed man around the complex, including details that could only have been observed by someone who had conducted a thorough reconnaissance of their positions. The silence on the phone told Sarah everything she needed to know about how her intelligence had been received. "How did you?" Kane began. "Mr. Kane, I'm going to give you and your people exactly 5 minutes to leave this location. If anyone is still here after 5 minutes, I'm going to consider them a hostile threat and respond accordingly. Ms. Martinez, you're outnumbered 8-1. Even with your training, those aren't good odds." Sarah looked through her night vision equipment at the positions of Castellano's men, noting their poor tactical spacing and lack of coordination. "Mr. Kane, you're thinking like a criminal. I'm thinking like a soldier. There's a difference." Sarah ended the call and immediately moved to her first target. She had learned during her military service that the key to defeating a larger force was to strike quickly and eliminate their ability to coordinate their response. The first shooter was positioned on a catwalk overlooking the main approach to the grain elevator. Sarah approached him from below, moving silently up a maintenance ladder until she was directly beneath his position. She neutralized him with a sleeper hold that left him unconscious but unharmed. The second shooter was positioned in a storage building with a clear view of the parking area. Sarah approached his location by moving through the grain processing equipment, using the industrial machinery to mask her movement. She disabled him with a nerve strike that temporarily paralyzed his arms. One by one, Sarah systematically eliminated Castellano's shooters using non-lethal techniques that left them unconscious or temporarily incapacitated. Her military training had taught her to complete missions with minimal casualties, and she applied those same principles to neutralizing Castellano's ambush. By the time she reached the main building where Castellano was supposedly waiting, she had disabled all 8 of his backup shooters without firing a single shot or causing any permanent injuries. Sarah entered the main building through a service entrance that allowed her to approach Castellano's location from an unexpected direction. She found him waiting in what had once been the main office, along with Thomas Kane and 2 additional bodyguards. "Mr. Castellano," Sarah said, stepping into the office with her hands visible but ready to move quickly. "I believe you wanted to discuss a peaceful resolution to our current situation." Castellano turned to face her, and Sarah could see in his expression that he was beginning to understand exactly what kind of opponent he was dealing with. "Ms. Martinez, I have to admit I'm impressed. My men haven't checked in for the past 15 minutes, which suggests you've somehow dealt with all of them. They're all alive and will recover completely," Sarah said. "I don't kill people unless they give me no other choice." Kane stepped forward, his hand moving toward a concealed weapon. "Mr. Castellano, she's just one person. We can still..." "Mr. Kane," Sarah interrupted, "I wouldn't recommend it. Your backup is already neutralized, and you're in an enclosed space with someone who has been trained to handle exactly this type of situation." Castellano studied Sarah's face and recognized the calm confidence of someone who had faced life and death situations many times before. "Ms. Martinez, what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you pack up your operation and leave Millfield permanently. Take your organization somewhere else, and find victims who don't have anyone willing to protect them." Castellano laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Ms. Martinez, even if you eliminate me tonight, my organization has connections throughout this region. Other people will take my place, and they might not be as reasonable as I am." Sarah nodded. "I've considered that possibility, which is why I've spent the past week documenting your entire operation and providing that information to federal law enforcement agencies." She pulled out her phone and showed Castellano a series of photographs she had taken of his various business operations, along with detailed financial records that proved his involvement in money laundering and tax evasion. "The FBI received copies of all this information this afternoon," Sarah continued, "along with evidence of your attempted bombing of Mrs. Chin's coffee shop. Federal agents are probably executing search warrants for your properties right now." Kane reached for his weapon, but Sarah moved faster than he could draw it. She disarmed him with a technique that left him holding his wrist in pain while his gun clattered across the floor. Castellano's remaining bodyguards looked uncertain about whether to intervene, clearly recognizing that they were outmatched by someone with superior training and preparation. "Mr. Castellano," Sarah said, "you have two choices. You can surrender to federal authorities and cooperate with their investigation, which might earn you some consideration in sentencing. Or you can try to continue this fight against someone who has spent 8 years learning how to eliminate threats to innocent people." Castellano looked around the office at his disabled associates and realized that his carefully planned ambush had been turned into a complete defeat by one woman who understood warfare better than he understood crime. "What guarantee do I have that you won't simply eliminate me regardless of what I choose?" Castellano asked. Sarah looked him directly in the eyes with the kind of steady gaze that comes from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. "Mr. Castellano, if I wanted you dead, you would already be dead. I'm offering you a chance to walk away because I prefer to solve problems without unnecessary violence." At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air as federal agents and local law enforcement arrived at the grain elevator complex. Sheriff Bradley had been monitoring Sarah's location using GPS equipment she had agreed to carry, and backup had been positioned nearby in case the situation escalated beyond her ability to control. As FBI agents arrested Castellano and his associates, Sarah walked outside to find Sheriff Bradley waiting for her. "Ms. Martinez," he said, "is it over?" Sarah looked around at the grain elevator complex where she had just dismantled an entire criminal organization without firing a shot or causing any permanent injuries. "It's over, Sheriff. Castellano's organization is finished, and the people of Millfield don't have to be afraid anymore." 3 weeks later, Sarah was back at Mrs. Chin's coffee shop, reading the morning newspaper while enjoying her usual coffee with an extra shot of espresso. The front page carried a story about the conviction of Vincent Castellano on federal charges of extortion, money laundering, and attempted murder using explosive devices. "Sarah," Mrs. Chin said, bringing over a plate of fresh muffins, "I still can't believe how quickly everything changed. 3 weeks ago, we were all terrified of these criminals, and now they're all in federal prison." Sarah looked around the coffee shop, which had returned to its normal atmosphere of quiet conversation and friendly community interaction. Sometimes bullies only have power because good people are afraid to fight back. Once someone stands up to them, they turn out to be not nearly as dangerous as they pretended to be. David Chun, who was back to doing homework at his usual table, looked up from his textbook. "Sarah, what are you going to do now? Are you going to stay in Millfield?" Sarah considered the question. She had come to Millfield seeking a quiet retirement from the world of violence and conflict, but the past month had reminded her that sometimes the skills she had learned in service of her country were exactly the skills her community needed. "I think I'll stay," Sarah said. "I've discovered that retirement doesn't have to mean disappearing completely. Sometimes the best way to enjoy peace is to make sure you're prepared to protect it when necessary." As Sarah finished her coffee and prepared to leave for her morning walk, she reflected on the fact that her military training had taught her to complete missions and protect innocent people. The mission had changed, and the location was different, but the core purpose remained the same. Outside the coffee shop, Millfield had returned to being the quiet, peaceful town that had originally attracted her. The difference was that now she knew her neighbors, and they knew they could count on her if anyone ever tried to threaten their community again. Sarah Martinez had come to Millfield seeking an escape from her past as a Navy SEAL. Instead, she had learned that the best parts of her military service, the commitment to protecting innocent people and standing up to bullies, were exactly the qualities her new community needed. As she walked down Main Street, greeting neighbors and enjoying the peaceful morning, Sarah realized that she had found something better than retirement. She had found a home worth protecting and a community that valued the skills she had spent years developing. The people who had tried to intimidate her had learned that some opponents are far more dangerous than they appear, and that threatening the wrong person's family is a mistake that carries consequences they never expected to face. Vincent Castellano and his organization had discovered that Sarah Martinez was not just a former Navy SEAL living quietly in a small town. She was a protector who would use every skill she had learned in service of her country to defend the community she had chosen as her home. And in Millfield, Montana, that was all the protection anyone would ever need.